Chapter 1. The Torn Gloves. On that rainy Dublin morning, a young woman with calloused hands faced humiliation before a crowd that treated her as invisible. But no one could have imagined that behind that silent pain lay a secret capable of bringing down entire families, exposing buried guilt and turning upside down the destinies of people who should never have crossed paths. Between the weight of the past and the gleam of wealth, an unexpected collision would bring face to face two lives that were never meant to intersect. What began with a silent glance would soon transform into a war of dignity, power, and redemption. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare that city for what was about to be revealed. And when the truth finally came to light, it wouldn't just destroy reputations, but hearts. The black bag burst with a sharp crack, and the rotten liquid poured down Oive Kavanagh's arm, soaking through the sleeve of her already threadbare woolen jumper. Against this brutal contrast, the iron gate of the mansion on Aylesbury Road seemed even more imposing, gleaming beneath Dublin's fine drizzle. A wife, with her torn yellow gloves, wiped her face discreetly, pretending not to see her reflection in the gate's glass panels. On the other side, without her noticing, a man in a dark overcoat watched in silence, observing her every movement with an intensity that suggested this encounter was no mere coincidence. As she pushed the metal trolley down the narrow path, her boots squelching against the wet pavement, a luxury car braked sharply beside her. The engine's purr was so quiet she barely heard it approach, a stark contrast to the rattling bus that had brought her here from Ballymun at 5:30 that morning. Two lads laughed loudly from the passenger window. "Look here, the queen of rubbish." A mobile phone was raised, its lens pointed straight at her, and within seconds that mockery took the form of a video. A wife, her dignity wounded, lowered her head, but she couldn't help hearing the cutting phrase that sliced through her like a blade. "Pretty enough, she is, but still just a bin collector." It was a small attack, but one that burned like a flame, and a harbinger of something far greater to come. The weight of that morning pressed down on her shoulders like the gray Dublin sky itself. She'd grown accustomed to the stares, the whispered comments, the way people's eyes would slide past her as though she were invisible. But something about this moment felt different, charged with a tension she couldn't quite place. The paper in her gloved hands seemed to pulse with significance, though she couldn't understand why. Behind the ornate windows of the Aylesbury Road mansion, curtains twitched almost imperceptibly. The neighborhood had always been a world apart from her small flat in Ballymun, where she'd wake each morning to the sound of traffic and the persistent damp that crept through every crack in the walls. Here, in this leafy enclave of Dublin's elite, even the air seemed cleaner, more refined. The trees were pruned to perfection, the footpaths swept clean, the very existence of people like her carefully hidden from view. The torn yellow gloves that protected her hands had seen better days. Much like everything else in her life, they were practical, unglamorous, a barrier between her skin and the refuse of a city that barely acknowledged her existence. Yet she wore them with a quiet dignity that no amount of mockery could strip away. Her mother, Sorcia, had taught her that much. "Hold your head high, love. Work honest is work honorable, no matter what they say." Those words had carried her through 3 years of this job, through the looks of pity and disgust, through the way conversation would stop when she entered a shop still wearing her high-visibility jacket. As she bent to retrieve another bag, the sleeve of her jacket rode up, revealing a thin gold bracelet, the only piece of jewelry she owned, a gift from her late father. It caught the weak Dublin sunlight for just a moment, a tiny flash of something precious amidst the mundane reality of her daily routine. The bracelet bore a small Celtic knot, worn smooth by years of wear, and sometimes she would touch it when the world felt particularly unkind, remembering his voice, "You're worth more than they'll ever know, Mostor." The lads in the car were long gone, but their laughter still echoed in her ears. She'd learned to build walls around such moments, to let the cruelty bounce off her like rain off a coat. But today, with the mysterious paper in her hand and the weight of unseen eyes upon her, those walls felt thinner than usual. The video they'd taken would be on social media within minutes, she knew. More fuel for the gossip mills, more evidence for those who believed people like her should know their place and stay in it. On the mansion's veranda, the mysterious man never looked away. Oife, unknowing, was mere seconds from having her life intertwined with his in ways that would reshape everything she thought she knew about justice, truth, and the price of dignity. As she pulled out another bag, a torn piece of paper that fell to the ground caught her attention. An old piece of correspondence bearing the seal, Moreau Holdings. the same surname engraved in golden letters on the mansion's postbox. She hesitated, holding the soiled paper whilst the man's shadow slowly advanced in her direction. The morning mist seemed to thicken around them both, as though Dublin itself was holding its breath. Alweef straightened slowly, the paper trembling slightly in her torn gloves. Something about the name Moreau stirred a memory, not quite formed, but uncomfortable, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She'd heard it before, whispered in the corridors of her childhood, spoken in the same breath as words like tragedy and cover-up, but the memory remained frustratingly elusive, dancing just beyond her grasp. The man's footsteps were silent on the wet gravel, but she could sense his approach like a change in the weather. When she finally lifted her eyes and found Declan Moreau standing directly before her, as though he had been waiting for her all along, the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. This was the moment, though neither of them could have known it then, when two lives that should never have intersected would become inextricably bound together by secrets that had been buried for far too long. Chapter 2. The Unlikely Invitation. Declan Moreau didn't give his name straight away. He simply picked up the envelope from the ground and, with a firm voice that carried the authority of generations of wealth, asked, "Do you know what this seal means?" Aoife, taken aback by the directness of his question and the way he seemed to study her face as though searching for something specific, merely replied that she didn't. But the sensation that this man was evaluating her beyond the obvious, beyond the torn gloves and the stained uniform, left her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the insistent buzzing of the millionaire's mobile phone. Someone was clearly desperate to remind him of an important meeting at Trinity College, the caller ID flashing repeatedly across the expensive device. He glanced at it once, then deliberately pressed the decline button, his eyes never leaving Oif's face. That simple gesture, choosing to ignore what was undoubtedly an urgent business matter to focus entirely on her, sent a shiver down her spine that she couldn't quite explain. Hours later, in a corner cafe in Ballsbridge, Oif was surprised to see him again. The establishment was one of those places she'd walked past hundreds of times but never dared enter. All gleaming espresso machines and artisanal pastries that cost more than she earned in half a day. The warm lighting cast everything in a golden glow, and the soft murmur of conversation created an atmosphere of refined intimacy that felt utterly foreign to someone who usually grabbed her tea from a vending machine. He called to her by recognizing her collection company uniform, which she'd folded carefully over her arm, self-conscious about the lingering smell of refuse that seemed to cling to the reflective fabric no matter how often she washed it. When he praised her courage in the face of the humiliation she'd suffered, something in his voice suggested he understood what it meant to stand alone against judgment. There was a weight to his words that went beyond mere politeness, as though he too knew what it felt like to be seen as something he wasn't. "You have attentive eyes," he said, leaning forward slightly across the small table they'd somehow found themselves sharing. "I want someone who truly knows the city." The words were delivered like a test, his gaze searching her face for her reaction. Oif laughed nervously, the sound slightly too high, too brittle, but she accepted nonetheless. It was the first time anyone had seen in her more than just a bin collector, more than just another invisible member of Dublin's working class. The invitation itself was printed on heavy paper, the kind that spoke of serious money and serious intentions. The Trinity College crest was embossed in gold, and beneath it details of a presentation about sustainability and community engagement. Oif's fingers, still bearing the indent marks from her work gloves, traced the elegant lettering as though it might disappear if she looked away. "Sustainability," he'd said, and Oif had almost laughed. What would a man who lived behind iron gates know about sustaining anything? Yet there was something in his manner, a gravity, a sincerity, that made her pause. When he mentioned her attentive eyes, she thought of all the things she'd noticed over the years. The way affluent neighborhoods generated different rubbish, the patterns of waste that told stories about lives lived behind closed doors, the casual extravagance that others took for granted. That same evening, back in her Ballymun flat, the video of her humiliation was already circulating through WhatsApp and local Facebook groups like wildfire. The small screen of her secondhand phone lit up constantly with notifications, each one another twist of the knife. Cruel comments multiplied with the vicious speed that only social media could provide. Trying to get noticed, going to find herself a millionaire to clean up her life. Always knew she thought she was better than the rest of us. Oif deleted the notifications with increasingly frantic taps, but her chest felt heavy, as though someone had placed a stone there that grew larger with each cruel word. The flat felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in around her as she sat at the tiny kitchen table, staring at the expensive invitation that seemed almost to mock her in its elegant simplicity. Her mother, Sorcia, emerged from the bedroom, where she'd been listening to the radio whilst mending a torn hem, and took one look at her daughter's face. "What's got you looking like you've seen a ghost, love?" she asked, settling into the chair opposite with the careful movements of someone whose joints had seen too many years of hard labor. When Awif explained about the encounter, about the invitation, about the man who'd seemed to see something in her that no one else ever had, Sorcia's weathered fingers traced the embossed lettering with the same wonder her daughter had shown. "What's a Moreau want with the likes of us?" she asked, and the name seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with implications neither could quite grasp. The online comments had stung more than she cared to admit. People she'd known from school, neighbors who'd once been kind, all of them ready to assume the worst. The video had captured her moment of vulnerability perfectly, the way her shoulders had sagged when the lads had called her the queen of rubbish. But it hadn't captured the fire that had burned in her chest, the quiet determination that kept her working honest jobs when easier paths beckoned. Declan's invitation seemed like an open door, but also an abyss. What lay on the other side of that heavy paper and golden lettering? What did a man like him really want from a woman like her? The questions multiplied in her mind like the cruel comments on her phone, each one more troubling than the last. As the night wore on and the notifications finally slowed, Awaifa found herself reading and rereading one particular comment, the words seeming to pulse with malevolent energy on the small screen. Among the dozens of cruel jibes and thoughtless cruelty, this one made her blood run cold, stirring memories she'd tried so hard to bury. The Moreaus never change. They're still killing people in Ballymun. Chapter 3. The Echo of the Past. The lecture at Trinity College's auditorium was nothing short of a shock. Awif entered timidly, still carrying the faint scent of cheap detergent on her hands despite scrubbing them raw in the ladies' room, but watched as Declan Moreau was received with thunderous applause. The auditorium itself was magnificent, all carved wood panels and stained glass windows that caught the afternoon light and scattered it in jeweled patterns across the assembled crowd. She felt like an intruder in this temple of learning, acutely aware of her second-hand clothes and the way her shoes squeaked slightly against the polished floors. He spoke eloquently of clean energy, green innovation, and community projects, his voice carrying easily across the vast space without the need for amplification. The audience, academics, politicians, business leaders, hung on his every word, occasionally murmuring their approval or jotting down notes. But when he cited Ballymun as an example of outstanding urban regeneration and community resilience, Awif's blood turned to fire in her veins. The words felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Ballymun, the estate where she'd grown up, where concrete towers scraped the gray Dublin sky and where hope went to die slowly, one broken promise at a time. It was the place where her father's lungs had filled with poison over the course of 23 years, working construction jobs that paid barely enough to keep food on the table, where her mother still lived, in the same flat where the damp crept through the walls like a living thing, where the heating worked sporadically and the lift was more often broken than not. During the interval, as Trinity students and Dublin's elite mingled over glasses of wine and delicate canapes, Awif pushed through the crowd with a determination that surprised even her. She found Declan near the refreshment table, surrounded by admirers who clearly saw him as some sort of visionary, and confronted him with words that came from a place of deep, ancestral pain. Regeneration? Ballymun never regenerated anything. What it did was learn to swallow hunger with silence and bury sickness with cheap funerals. Her voice carried further than she'd intended, and several nearby conversations faltered as heads turned in their direction. Declan's face went ashen, and for a moment the polished facade of the successful businessman cracked like ice under pressure. She could see something raw and unguarded flicker across his features. Guilt, perhaps, or recognition. He tried to explain, stumbling over words that usually came to him with practiced ease, saying the company was under different management now, a completely different era. But Awif wasn't listening to his carefully constructed excuses. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, its edges soft with age and handling. It was a piece of her father's legacy that she'd carried with her for years. A small article about chemical poisoning in residential buildings, dated 20 years ago. The headline read, "Toxic Materials Found in Ballymun Construction Projects. Moreau Holdings Under Investigation." She unfolded it with hands that trembled only slightly and held it up between them like a shield against his words. "My father wasn't just a statistic in your corporate files," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting. "He had a name. Cian Kavanaugh. He built your profits with his own hands, and your company repaid him with poison that ate his lungs from the inside out." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with accumulated grief and rage that had been building for 2 decades. The sophisticated crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing the electricity of a confrontation that went far deeper than business disagreements. Some pretended not to listen, while straining to catch every word. Others openly stared, their wine glasses forgotten in their hands. Declan looked around at the watching faces, then back at Awaf, and she could see him calculating, weighing the cost of this public scene against whatever conscience he might possess. As she turned to leave the auditorium, her chest tight with emotion and her hands shaking with adrenaline, a firm grip caught her arm just outside the main doors. It wasn't Declan, but a woman with distinguished gray hair swept back in an elegant chignon, wearing the kind of understated but expensive clothing that screamed old money. Her face was sharp, intelligent, and her eyes held a warning that made Awaf's skin prickle with sudden fear. "Don't meddle with the Moreaus, dear," the woman whispered, her voice carrying the educated tones of Dublin's professional class, but undercut with something that sounded almost like desperation. "They've buried more than concrete in Ballymun, and some graves are better left undisturbed." The woman's fingers pressed into Awaf's arm with surprising strength, and there was something in her eyes, a knowledge, a terrible understanding, that suggested she spoke from personal experience. Before Awaf could ask what she meant, what she knew, the elegant stranger had melted back into the crowd of departing academics and politicians, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and a business card pressed into Awaf's palm. The card was heavy cream-colored stock with simple black lettering that read only NR, followed by a mobile number. No company name, no address, just those 2 initials embossed with a precision that suggested money and influence. Standing on the steps of Trinity College as Dublin's evening traffic rumbled past, Ave felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The card seemed to burn against her palm, a tangible connection to secrets she didn't yet understand, but somehow knew would change everything. Chapter 4. The Open Wound. Back in her small flat in Ballymun, with the familiar sounds of late-night Dublin filtering through the thin walls, sirens in the distance, voices echoing in the courtyard below, the persistent drip of the kitchen tap that never quite shut off properly, Awaf examined the mysterious business card under the harsh fluorescent light. NR. The initials seemed to pulse with significance, and after an hour of staring at them, she finally worked up the courage to search the number online. Niamh Renault, investigative journalist. The name appeared in dozens of articles spanning the past 15 years, each one a scathing expose of corruption, cover-ups, and corporate malfeasance across Ireland. She'd brought down politicians, exposed fraudulent charities, and made her reputation by following paper trails that others were too frightened or too bought off to pursue. The woman who'd accosted her outside Trinity wasn't just any concerned citizen. She was Ireland's most feared investigative reporter. With trembling fingers, Awaf dialed the number, her heart hammering against her ribs. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. Niamh Renault. There was no warmth in the greeting, but there was something else. An alertness, as though she'd been expecting this call. "You gave me your card," Awaf began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Outside Trinity College. You warned me about the Moreaus." "Awaf Kavanaugh," Niamh said, and the fact that she already knew her name sent a chill down Awaf's spine. "I've been hoping you'd ring. We need to talk, but not over the phone. There are things about Moreau Holdings that go far deeper than a few dodgy building contracts. Your father wasn't the only one who died because of their negligence." They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe in Temple Bar, away from the prying eyes of Dublin's business district. Awaf spent the intervening hours in a state of nervous agitation, unable to concentrate on anything. She'd taken the day off work, her first sick day in 2 years, and spent it pacing the small flat, looking through old photo albums, touching the few possessions that remained from her father's life. The meeting with Niamh Renault was unlike anything Awaf could have imagined. The journalist arrived precisely on time, carrying a worn leather satchel that looked like it had seen decades of use. She was smaller than she'd seemed outside Trinity, but her presence filled the small cafe booth as she spread out photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. Moreau Holdings, Neef began without preamble, has been covering up workplace deaths and environmental poisoning for over 30 years. The official records show occasional safety violations, a few modest fines, the usual corporate slap on the wrist, but the reality is far more sinister. She slid a photograph across the table, a construction site from the 1990s. Workers in hard hats and inadequate protective gear, clouds of dust hanging in the air like a toxic fog. This was taken at one of their Ballymun renovation projects in 1998. Neef continued, her voice steady but her eyes burning with the passion of someone who'd spent years seeking justice. The workers were told it was safe, that the dust masks they were given were sufficient protection. What they weren't told was that the buildings contained asbestos, lead paint, and chemical compounds that had been banned in most of Europe but were still being used because they were cheaper. Aoife stared at the photograph, searching the faces of the workers for one that might be familiar. In the background, barely visible, she could make out the towers of Ballymun rising against the Dublin sky. Her father would have been working construction around that time, moving from site to site, taking whatever jobs he could find to support his young family. Your father, Neef said gently, consulting her notes. Cian Kavanagh. He worked on at least 3 Moreau Holdings projects between 1997 and 2001. The company has no record of providing him with adequate safety equipment or informing him of the hazardous materials he was exposed to daily. She paused, watching Aoife's face carefully. He died of mesothelioma in 2010, didn't he? Aged 51, Aoife could only nod, her throat suddenly too tight for words. The memories came flooding back. Her father's increasing breathlessness, the way he'd tried to hide his pain, the bitter irony of a man who'd spent his life building homes dying slowly in a hospital bed whilst the rent on their flat fell further behind each month. The thing is, Neef continued, pulling out another document, Declan Moreau wasn't just some innocent bystander in all this. He was on the board of directors during the worst period of the cover-up. He attended meetings where safety concerns were dismissed, where the decision was made to continue using dangerous materials because switching to safer alternatives would have cost the company millions in profits. She slid a photocopied page across the table. Meeting minutes from March 2001, marked confidential in red letters across the top. Aoife's eyes scanned the corporate jargon until she found what Neef was pointing to. A paragraph discussing acceptable risk levels and cost-benefit analysis of safety upgrades. At the bottom of the page, among a list of attendees, was a name that made her stomach lurch. D. Moreau. The cafe around them seemed to fade away as Aoife absorbed the implications. The man who'd invited her to Trinity, who'd spoken so eloquently about community regeneration and corporate responsibility, had been part of the machine that had killed her father. The elegant words about sustainability and green innovation were just another layer of polish over a foundation built on human suffering. There's more, Neef said quietly, her voice barely audible over the cafe's background noise. I've been investigating Moreau Holdings for 3 years, following paper trails and buried reports. There are at least 17 families in Ballymun alone who lost someone to work-related illness after exposure on their sites. 17 families who were told their loved ones died of natural causes, who were given small compensation payments in exchange for signing non-disclosure agreements. That evening, back in her flat with the rain pattering against the windows and her mother asleep in the next room, Aoife sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by photocopied documents that Neef had left with her. Each page was another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of the company that had destroyed so many lives whilst presenting itself as a pillar of the community. She was still reading when she heard the soft sound of an envelope being slipped under her front door. For a moment she sat frozen, listening for footsteps in the corridor but heard nothing except the building's familiar nighttime sounds. The wheeze of old pipes, the murmur of television sets through thin walls, the distant sound of traffic on the main road. The envelope was thick, expensive paper that felt wrong in this shabby hallway, and inside were photocopied pages that made her blood run cold. They were internal company memos, marked with various levels of confidentiality, discussing the Ballymun projects and the need to manage potential liability issues. But what made her hands shake was the signature at the bottom of several documents. Not a photocopy this time, but what appeared to be an original. The bold, confident signature of Declan Moreau. Chapter 5. The Tempest. The photocopied board meeting minutes left no room for doubt whatsoever. There, in black and white, was Declan Moreau's signature, alongside those of other directors, authorizing the continued use of materials they knew to be dangerous, approving cost-cutting measures that would condemn workers to slow, agonizing deaths. A wife sat in her cramped kitchen until the early hours of the morning, tracing that signature with her finger, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in her chest like a physical pain. When Niamh Renault's article hit the Irish Independent's website at 6 o'clock that morning, it was with the force of a demolition ball striking a condemned building. Ghosts of Ballymun. New documents exposed decades of corporate negligence ran across the homepage in bold headlines, accompanied by a photograph of Awife taken outside Trinity College. She wasn't the main focus of the image, but her face was clearly visible, and within minutes the story had spread across social media like wildfire. The phone calls began before 7. First, her supervisor at the waste collection company, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "What the hell have you got yourself mixed up in, Kavanagh? We can't have our employees making wild accusations against our contractors." Then neighbors, some supportive but many accusatory, wondering why she thought she was better than the rest of them, why she couldn't just keep her head down and her mouth shut like everyone else in Ballymun had learned to do. But it was the online response that truly cut to the bone. The same platforms that had mocked her just days earlier now erupted with fresh venom. Comments poured in with vicious creativity. "Gold-digging bin woman thinks she's found her ticket out. Always knew she was too pretty for her own good. Probably sleeping with the journalist for attention." Each notification was another small wound. Death by 1,000 digital cuts. At her mother's flat, where she'd fled to escape the constant ringing of her own phone, Sorsha made endless cups of tea with hands that trembled slightly as she poured. "I remember when your father first got sick," she said quietly, staring out the window at the gray concrete towers that had defined their lives for so long. "He kept saying it wasn't right, that too many of the lads were getting the same thing. But who was going to listen to a construction worker from Ballymun?" The worst part was the way former friends and neighbors now looked at her with suspicion and resentment. In the local shop where she'd bought her groceries for years, the cashier avoided eye contact and processed her purchases in hostile silence. On the street, conversations would stop abruptly when she approached, resuming only after she'd passed with pointed comments about people getting too big for their boots. In Ballsbridge and the other affluent neighborhoods where she'd once been invisible, the reaction was equally hostile but more refined. The same people who'd previously looked through her as though she didn't exist now regarded her with open contempt, their whispered conversations following her as she tried to continue her work rounds. "That's the one," she heard a woman say outside a Georgian townhouse. "The one making all that fuss about nothing." It was late afternoon when Declan Moreau appeared at her mother's flat, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his face flushed with anger and something that might have been desperation. He'd clearly been drinking, not heavily, but enough to loosen the tight control he usually maintained over his emotions. When Awife opened the door, he pushed past her into the small sitting room, his presence filling the modest space like smoke from a fire. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "Those signatures, the documents Renault published, they're not what they seem. I was young, barely out of university, trying to change things from the inside." He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through files until he found what he was looking for. "Listen to this," he demanded, pressing play on an audio file. The recording was old, the quality poor, but clear enough to make out voices arguing in what sounded like a boardroom. Declan's voice, younger and more idealistic, could be heard challenging other participants about safety standards and worker protection. But each time he spoke, he was talked over, dismissed, his concerns swept aside by older, more experienced voices that spoke of profit margins and acceptable risks. "I tried to blow the whistle," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I went to the Health and Safety Authority, to journalists, even to politicians. But my family had money, influence. They buried every complaint, discredited every source, and when I kept pushing, they gave me a choice. Sign the documents they put in front of me or be cut off entirely, lose any chance of changing things from within." I've studied his face, searching for signs of deception, but all she could see was exhaustion and pain that seemed to go bone deep. The man who'd seemed so confident, so in control, now looked like someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight for decades. But the damage was already done. The story was out there, the accusations made, and the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. That evening, after Declan had left and the flat had settled into its familiar evening rhythms, another envelope appeared under the door. This one was thicker than the first, and when Oif opened it, several 50-euro notes scattered across the kitchen table like autumn leaves. The accompanying note was written in elegant handwriting on expensive stationery. Some wounds are better left to heal in silence. Consider this a down payment on your discretion. There's more where this came from if you know when to stop digging. Oif stared at the money, more cash than she'd seen in months of collecting bins, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just about corporate negligence anymore. It was about power, about the lengths some people would go to protect their secrets. The money felt contaminated, as though touching it would make her complicit in the very system that had killed her father. She was still sitting at the table, the notes spread before her like evidence of her own potential corruption, when she looked out the window and saw a familiar figure standing in the courtyard below. Declan Moreau stood motionless in the Dublin drizzle, his expensive overcoat dark with rain, staring up at the building as though it held the answer to questions he'd been asking himself for years. In that moment, silhouetted against the gray evening sky, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a man drowning in the consequences of choices he'd made long ago. Chapter 6. Cracks in the Glass. Our wife spent the entire night staring at the money scattered across her kitchen table, each note a temptation and an insult in equal measure. By morning, her decision was made with the clarity that only comes from moral conviction. She gathered up every 50-euro note, tore them methodically into pieces and stuffed the fragments into an envelope along with a single sheet of paper bearing 4 words: "Dignity has no price." Finding Declan Moreau proved easier than she'd expected. He was waiting in his car outside her building, looking as though he hadn't slept, his usually perfect appearance marred by stubble and wrinkled clothes. When she approached the passenger window and held up the envelope of torn money, something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the first flicker of genuine respect. "I'm refusing their money," she said simply, passing the envelope through the window. "But I'm not refusing the truth. If what you told me yesterday is real, if you genuinely tried to expose what was happening, then prove it. Show me evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. Because right now, all I have is your word against a paper trail that says you were complicit in my father's death." They drove in silence through Dublin's morning traffic to his office in the International Financial Services Centre, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the gray sky like an accusation. The building's lobby was all marble and minimalist design, a temple to wealth and corporate power that made Oif acutely conscious of her worn shoes and charity shop clothes. Declan's office occupied an entire corner of the 42nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of Dublin Bay and the mountains beyond. But it was what lay behind the false wall of his private safe that truly mattered. Dozens of audio recordings, copies of emails, photographs, and documents that painted a picture of a young man's desperate attempts to fight a system that seemed designed to crush conscience beneath the weight of profit. The recordings were damning, not of Declan, but of the company structure that had trapped him. In meeting after meeting, his voice could be heard raising concerns about worker safety, questioning the use of dangerous materials, demanding proper protective equipment for construction crews. And in meeting after meeting, he was overruled, patronized, and eventually threatened by his own family members and board colleagues. "This one's from September 2001, Declan said, his finger hovering over the play button of an old cassette recorder. "3 months before your father started showing symptoms. Listen carefully to what my uncle says at the end." The recording crackled to life, and through the static, Oif could hear a younger Declan's voice growing increasingly frustrated as he argued for safety protocols that would add mere thousands to budgets worth millions. The older voice that cut him off was cold, dismissive, and absolutely final. "You'll sign what we put in front of you, nephew, or you'll find yourself with no company to reform and no resources to help anyone. Sometimes the greater good requires smaller sacrifices. Learn to live with it or learn to live without us." As each piece of evidence emerged from the safe, Oif began to understand the impossible position Declan had found himself in, caught between his conscience and his family's threats, between his desire to help and his fear of losing the only platform he had to make changes. He wasn't the hero she might have hoped for, but he wasn't the villain she'd initially believed him to be either. He was something more complex and more human, a man broken by the weight of compromises he'd been forced to make. But the damage to both their reputations was already spreading through Dublin like a virus. The morning newspapers had picked up Niamh's story, and radio talk shows were filled with callers debating whether Oif was a brave whistleblower or an opportunistic gold digger. The consensus seemed to be shifting towards the latter, helped by carefully planted stories about her sudden friendship with a billionaire and speculation about her real motives for going public. On social media, the attacks had intensified overnight. Someone had created a fake profile using her photograph, posting inflammatory comments designed to make her appear greedy and manipulative. Anonymous accounts shared increasingly personal details about her life, her father's death, her family's financial struggles, even photos of her flat and workplace. The message was clear: this is what happens to people who step out of line. Meanwhile, Declan's business associates and family members were quietly distancing themselves from him. Board meetings were canceled, investment deals put on hold, and social invitations mysteriously withdrawn. The Irish business community, tight-knit and protective of its own, was closing ranks against someone they now saw as a liability, a man who'd allowed a working-class woman to embarrass them all. It was Niamh Renault who provided the next twist, appearing at Oif's door on Thursday evening with a proposal that would change everything. "I've been contacted by RTA," she said, settling into the small sitting room with the confidence of someone accustomed to delivering life-altering news. "They want to do a live television special about corporate accountability in Ireland. They want you as the face of the story, a real person affected by corporate negligence, someone who can speak for all the families who've been silenced by money and legal threats." The prospect of appearing on national television, of having her face and story broadcast to the entire country, filled Oifa with a terror so profound it made her physically ill. She'd seen what happened to people who challenged the powerful in Ireland. They were discredited, ostracized, sometimes driven from the country entirely by the weight of public hostility and legal pressure. "Think about it," Niamh continued, her journalist's instincts sensing Oif's fear. "This isn't just about your father anymore, or even about Moreau Holdings. This is about a pattern of corporate behavior that's been protected by silence for decades. You have the chance to speak for people who can no longer speak for themselves." When Declan learned about the television proposal, and he learned quickly, thanks to Dublin's efficient gossip networks, he appeared at her flat within hours, his face pale with genuine fear for her safety. "You can't do this," he said, his voice urgent with desperation. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. These people have resources, connections, the ability to destroy lives completely. If you go on that program, if you put yourself in front of the cameras as the face of this story, they will annihilate you." But Oifa had spent 3 sleepless nights thinking about her father, about the 17 other families Niamh had mentioned, about all the voices that had been silenced by fear and money. She looked at Declan, this complicated, damaged man who'd tried to do right within a corrupt system, and made her choice with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of invisible labor and casual humiliation. "And if I don't step up to that podium," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, "who will remember the dead of Ballymun?" Chapter 7. The Square and the Gloves. The cold Dublin wind whipped across the cobblestones in front of Mansion House, where a crowd of unprecedented size had gathered despite the gray October morning. Television cameras from RTE, BBC, and Sky News formed a semicircle around the hastily erected podium, their lenses trained on the makeshift press conference that had captured the attention of the entire island. Journalists from national newspapers jostled for position alongside bloggers and social media influencers, whilst curious Dubliners pressed against the barriers that Gardaí had erected to maintain some semblance of order. Oif approached the podium wearing the same high-visibility jacket she'd worn on that first morning outside the Aylesbury Road mansion, and most significantly, the same yellow rubber gloves, now clean, but still bearing the scars of honest labor. The symbolism wasn't lost on the assembled crowd, and murmurs rippled through the gathering as she climbed the wooden steps with a dignity that seemed to grow stronger with each stride. When she reached the microphone, the crowd fell silent in a way that Dublin crowds rarely did. Even the traffic on nearby Dame Street seemed to quiet, as though the entire city was holding its breath. She raised her gloved hands, letting the cameras capture the yellow rubber that had become an unlikely symbol of working-class resistance, and began to speak in a voice that carried clearly across the square. "They called me a Gary," she said, her words cutting through the crisp air with the precision of a blade. "They called me rubbish, an opportunist, a gold digger who didn't know her place. Today I stand before you not to defend myself, but to speak for those who can no longer defend themselves. The workers of Ballymun, the fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters who died in silence whilst their employers counted profits built on their suffering. As she spoke, pulling out the documents that Niamh Renault had helped her organize, camera flashes erupted like lightning across the square. The papers rustled in the wind as she held them up. Board meeting minutes, safety reports that had been ignored, correspondence between executives who had knowingly prioritized profit over human life. Each document was another nail in the coffin of corporate impunity that had protected the powerful for too long. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Some shouted questions, others raised their fists in solidarity, and from somewhere in the back, a woman's voice called out, "Tell them about my husband." The gathering had become something larger than a press conference. It was a moment of collective catharsis for a community that had been silenced for too long. It was then that the unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure began pushing through the mass of bodies with determined purpose. Declan Moreau, his expensive overcoat making him stand out amongst the crowd of ordinary Dubliners, approached the podium with his face set in lines of grim resolution. Whispers followed his progress. "That's him. That's the Moreau heir. What's he doing here?" When he reached the edge of the media area, instead of trying to stop AWEF or defend his company, he did something that stunned everyone present. He gestured to the microphone, and after a moment's hesitation, AWEF stepped aside to let him speak. The square fell completely silent. The only sound, the distant rumble of Dublin traffic and the whir of camera motors capturing this unprecedented moment. "My family," Declan began, his voice carrying across the square with the weight of generations of guilt, "built our fortune on the blood and lungs of working people. I signed those documents, yes. I signed them under threat, under pressure, under the naive belief that I could change things from within. But I signed them nonetheless, and I have carried that guilt every day since." His voice broke slightly, and several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed this public confession. AOF Kavanagh has shown more courage in these past weeks than I have shown in 20 years of trying to live with my family's legacy. She has risked everything, her job, her reputation, her safety, to speak truth to power. She has done what I should have done decades ago, and I stand here today not to defend myself, but to support her call for justice. The crowd's response was mixed. Some applauded, others jeered, and many simply stood in shocked silence at this unprecedented public acknowledgement of corporate wrongdoing. But before anyone could fully process what they'd witnessed, a new commotion erupted at the edge of the square. A group of men in expensive suits had arrived, pushing through the crowd with the entitlement that comes from generations of wealth and power. They were representatives of Moreau Holdings' board of directors, accompanied by lawyers whose very presence radiated threat and intimidation. The lead figure, a silver-haired man who bore a strong resemblance to Declan, approached the podium with a leather briefcase that seemed to pulse with significance. "Miss Kavanagh," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I think there's been quite enough drama for one day. Perhaps we can resolve this matter privately, like civilized people." He opened the briefcase with theatrical precision, revealing neat stacks of €50 notes, far more money than our wife had ever seen in one place. The square fell silent again, as everyone present understood the significance of the moment. This wasn't just about corporate accountability anymore. It was about whether money could still buy silence, whether the powerful could still escape justice by throwing cash at their problems. The cameras zoomed in on Oifa's face as she stared at the briefcase, and millions of people across Ireland and beyond waited to see what she would do. She looked at the money, then at the crowd of faces staring up at her expectantly, then at Declan, who stood beside the podium with his own future hanging in the balance. The weight of history pressed down on her shoulders, not just her own family's history, but the history of every working person who had ever been told to know their place, to accept their lot, to be grateful for whatever scraps the powerful chose to throw them. With movements that seemed almost ritualistic in their deliberation, Oif reached for the briefcase. The crowd held its breath as she lifted out the top bundle of notes, holding the money up so that every camera could capture the moment clearly. The bills fluttered in the Dublin wind like autumn leaves, and for a heartbeat, the entire square seemed suspended in time. Then, with a gesture that would be replayed on news programs for years to come, she tore the bundle in half, then tore it again, letting the fragments scatter across the cobblestones like confetti at a funeral. "Dignity," she said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned square, "has no price. Chapter 8. The Final Choice. The fragments of torn banknotes danced on Dublin's October wind, mixing with fallen leaves and discarded newspapers as they scattered across the cobblestones of Mansion House Square. Aoife slowly removed her yellow rubber gloves, those same gloves that had become an unlikely symbol of dignity in the face of adversity, and placed them carefully on the podium like a ceremonial offering. The gesture was simple, but in that moment it carried the weight of every working person who had ever been told they didn't matter. "My father died believing he was invisible," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "He died thinking that men like him, honest men who worked with their hands, who built the buildings that housed the wealthy and the powerful, were disposable, forgettable, worth nothing more than the wages they were paid." The microphone caught every word, carrying them across the square and into the homes of people watching across Ireland and beyond. "Today, I make sure he's remembered. Today, I make sure they all are remembered. Every worker who breathed poison because it was cheaper than safety. Every family that grieved in silence because they couldn't afford justice. Every voice that was silenced by money and power, and the belief that some lives matter more than others." Declan Moreau stepped forward then, his face etched with 20 years of suppressed guilt and newfound resolve. When he reached for the microphone, Aoife didn't resist. "If you want redemption, Declan," she said quietly, her words meant for him alone, but picked up by the sensitive equipment. "Prove it not to me but to Ballyman. Prove it to every family your company destroyed." The impact of that afternoon rippled outward from Mansion House Square like stones thrown into still water. Within hours, the footage was trending on social media platforms across the globe. The image of a working-class woman in yellow gloves tearing up a briefcase full of money became an instant symbol of resistance against corporate impunity. "Dignity has no price" began trending worldwide, with people sharing their own stories of workplace exploitation and corporate cover-ups. But it was the response from Moreau Holdings that truly shocked the Irish business community. 3 days after the press conference, the company issued a statement that no one had expected. Declan Moreau, in his capacity as heir to the family fortune, announced the establishment of a €50 million compensation fund for families affected by the company's negligent practices. More significantly, he publicly broke with his family's business interests, resigning from all board positions and donating his personal shares to a trust that would be administered by representatives of the affected communities. The announcement came with a full public apology that was broadcast live on RTA. Standing in the same boardroom where his family had made decisions that cost human lives, Declan faced the cameras with the hollow-eyed look of a man who had finally stopped running from his past. "For too long," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, "my family has hidden behind lawyers and public relations firms and the belief that money could erase the consequences of our actions. Today, that ends." The legal and political ramifications were swift and far-reaching. The Dáil launched a formal investigation into corporate safety practices, whilst the Director of Public Prosecutions announced that criminal charges would be considered against current and former executives of multiple companies. Niamh Renault's investigation had opened floodgates that had been sealed by decades of silence and complicity. For Aoife, the aftermath was both triumphant and bittersweet. The offers came flooding in. Book deals, speaking engagements, invitations to join corporate boards as an ethical oversight consultant. Television producers wanted to option her story. Politicians sought her endorsement, and advocacy groups offered her leadership positions. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. The Dublin City Council voted unanimously to name a small park in Ballymun, Cian Kavanagh Memorial Gardens, in honor of her father and all the workers who had died from preventable industrial diseases. 6 months later, Aoife was back where it all began, pushing her collection trolley down the narrow path beside the Aylesbury Road mansion. But everything had changed, even as everything remained the same. The same expensive cars still purred past, the same iron gates still gleamed in the Dublin drizzle, and she still wore the high-visibility jacket that marked her as part of the city's invisible workforce. Yet the way people looked at her now was entirely different. Where once there had been either indifference or mockery, now there was respect, sometimes grudging, but respect nonetheless. Shopkeepers who had once ignored her now nodded with genuine warmth. Children in Ballymun pointed her out to their parents with pride. "That's Aoife Kavanagh," they would whisper, "the one who stood up to the rich people." The mansion itself stood empty now, a for sale sign discreetly placed behind the iron railings. The Moreau family had quietly liquidated their Dublin properties and relocated to London, unable to withstand the sustained scrutiny that Oif's courage had brought upon them. The building that had once symbolized untouchable wealth and power now stood as a monument to the truth that no amount of money could purchase indefinite silence. As she worked, Oif found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with her mother the previous evening. Sorsha, now receiving treatment for the lung problems that had plagued her for years, treatment paid for by the compensation fund, had taken her daughter's hands in her own weathered ones. "Your father would be so proud," she'd said, her eyes bright with tears, "not because you brought down powerful people, but because you remembered that every person matters, that every life has dignity worth defending." The yellow gloves Oif wore now were new, unstained by the refuse of a city that had once treated her as refuse herself. But she'd kept the old ones, placing them in a frame on her kitchen wall alongside a photograph of her father, and the newspaper clipping that had started it all. They served as a reminder of where she'd come from, and more importantly, of the truth that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her fight for justice. Standing before the same iron gate where a mysterious man had first approached her with questions that would change everything, Oif adjusted her gloves and looked up at the empty windows of the mansion. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing patches of blue sky that promised better weather ahead. She thought about dignity and justice, about the price of silence and the cost of speaking truth to power. "It's not the gold that defines us," she murmured to herself, echoing words her father had once spoken, "but the weight we choose to carry." With that, she turned away from the empty mansion and continued down the Dublin street, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to be silenced, and that dignity, true dignity, can never be bought or sold, only lived. Sometimes the true weight of life isn't in what we carry in our hands, but in what we choose to carry in our hearts. The courage to say no to the easy path, the strength to maintain dignity when the entire world seems against us. That's what separates those who merely survive from those who truly live. And you, in the protagonist's place, would you have accepted the wealth and turned your back on your own history? Or would you have endured the pain to honor the memory of those who came before? How many of us would have the courage to pay the price of truth? If this story touched you, show the world. Some stories shouldn't just be heard, but remembered. The end.